I never believed the stories about Black Hollow Park when I first transferred here. My old station was a quiet national preserve where the worst danger you faced was some drunk camper getting lost or a bear tearing through garbage. But Black Hollow was different the moment I arrived. Something about the atmosphere in the valleys, the way the trees leaned like they were bending toward you, and the thick, almost chemical fog that hugged the ground at night made me feel like the park wasn't just an ecosystem, but a structure, like a giant living organism, watching every step. When I met the park supervisor, a grizzled man named Harold Briggs, he told me there were 4 rules the rangers here followed without exception. Never patrol the Hollow Road after midnight. Never respond to calls from the abandoned ranger tower on the North Ridge. Do not interact with anyone you see wearing a ranger uniform that you don't personally know. And if you hear whistling in the woods, you drop what you're doing and immediately return to base no matter who or what you're searching for. Because this park doesn't want you here at night, it doesn't want anyone here, and the things that wander the woods don't like being watched. I thought he was screwing with me, hazing the new guy, but the seriousness in his eyes, this haunted look, made me feel like he wasn't exaggerating at all, and I remember thinking, fine, I'll follow the rules. I'm not trying to die in the first month of duty, though at the time I imagined the threats were normal. Cougars, rabid animals, maybe a cult, but the reality was far stranger, and it started on my 3rd night, when I was paired with a ranger named Donna who had been here for 2 years, her face constantly tired like she had been awake for a decade. She moved slow, quiet, like someone who had learned the woods didn't appreciate noise, and when we hiked the southern trail, she told me, "People don't disappear here like they do in other parks. They get erased, like they were never born, like something edits the story and removes them," which sounded poetic and unstable, but the way she said it without irony gave me chills, and when we reached a clearing overlooking a valley, she pointed and said, "You see that? That's the Hollow. Don't ever enter it without someone who has survived it," which confused me until I saw the path leading into darkness, a corridor of trees so tight that sunlight didn't touch the ground even at noon. The next day, Briggs handed me the logbook, a thick binder with missing persons reports, sightings, wildlife notes, and what looked like personal journal entries written by panicked rangers. Most of the pages weren't about animals. They were about the Watchers, entities, described as tall, silent figures that appeared at dusk, wearing ranger uniforms but with faces too smooth, skin too pale, and movements too stiff, like they were imitating human behavior but couldn't quite replicate it, as though they were pretending to be us, standing among trees, staring into campsites at night. I couldn't tell if it was campfire legend or genuine psychological collapse, but there were dozens of accounts, many from credible, long-serving staff, and they all repeated one bizarre detail. If a false ranger waves at you, do not wave back, because acknowledging them invites pursuit, and they will follow you home. By the end of that week, I started to notice small things. The woods would fall silent so suddenly that it felt like someone had muted nature. I'd see shapes at the tree line that didn't move for minutes at a time, and sometimes my radio would pick up strange transmissions. Voices whispering coordinates of places that weren't on the map, followed by a scratching sound like teeth on metal. During a night shift, I heard someone calling for help near the lake, a man's voice yelling, "I'm hurt, please!" And Donna halted me with a grip so strong it hurt my arm, whispering, "Do not answer," before dragging me behind a fallen tree, and as we watched, a figure limped across the clearing, calling, "Help me," but its voice didn't change tone, didn't show pain or exhaustion. It just repeated the same line with the same inflection, like a recording, and when it turned its head toward us, I felt physically sick, because its face had no eyes, just smooth flesh, and its mouth stretched wider than human anatomy allowed, and then it smiled, a grotesque imitation of expression, before vanishing into the trees. After that, I couldn't sleep properly, and I understood why everyone here had that perpetual haunted stare. Things escalated when Briggs sent me, Donna, and a rookie named Cole to investigate a campsite that had radioed an emergency signal before going silent. The place was trashed, tents shredded like by claws, blood on the dirt, but no bodies, and as we searched, Cole found a camcorder half buried under leaves. On the footage, a group of campers sat around a fire late at night, laughing, until they heard whistling, faint at first, distant, then closer, circling them, and someone said, "That's just the wind, right?" Before something tall stepped into the firelight, wearing a ranger uniform, waving slowly, head tilted, and the campers waved back. One of the dumbest and most human reflexes in existence, and the second they did, the figure's arms snapped at an unnatural angle, like its bones rearranged, and the whistling became a shriek, and the camera fell sideways, capturing blurred chaos, running, screaming, and the sound of flesh ripping before the feed ended. We brought the footage back, and Briggs watched it silently, his jaw clenched, before turning to us and saying, "They learned it from us. Every time someone interacts, they learn more," and he burned the camera in a metal drum outside the station, saying, "You don't keep evidence of things that want attention," which, to my shock, felt less like paranoia and more like policy. A week later, during a storm, we heard radio static burst to life, followed by an exhausted voice saying, "Tower 7 to base, requesting urgent assistance," which wouldn't have been strange except Tower 7 had been abandoned since 1996 after a ranger killed himself inside it, leaving walls covered in symbols and warnings written in his blood. So Briggs ordered everyone to ignore the transmission, but Donna grabbed me and whispered, "They're testing you. They're learning which voices you respond to," which sounded insane, until the voice on the radio changed, shifting tone, imitating different emotions, crying, laughing, begging, like it was trying on identities until it found one that worked. The last straw for me came when we were tracking a missing child whose footprints vanished mid-trail, no sign of drag marks, no sign of struggle, just gone, and while searching, I heard footsteps behind me and turned to see myself. My exact face, uniform, posture, standing 10 yards away, staring at me without blinking, and it raised its hand to wave, slow, deliberate, like it knew the rule and wanted me to break it. I didn't wave, I didn't speak, I just backed away, heart hammering, until it slowly lowered its hand and melted into the fog, disappearing without a sound. I never told Briggs or Donna what I saw, because I knew what it meant. The park wasn't just stalking us, it was copying us, studying us, maybe replacing us, and when Cole vanished during a routine patrol, a man who had been perfectly fine hours earlier, I realized what everyone else here already knew. Nobody leaves Black Hollow unchanged, and some don't leave at all, and when they don't, something else leaves in their place. After Cole vanished, search teams combed the forest for him, even though every one of us already knew the cruel truth. When someone disappears in Black Hollow, you don't find their body, you find something pretending to be them, and I remember walking through the mist with a searchlight in my hand, calling his name even though it felt pointless, and the woods were unnaturally silent, not just quiet but listening, and I kept thinking about the faces we saw in the tree lean, the smooth white heads, with no features, tall bodies in ranger uniforms that didn't belong to anyone living, copies made from memory or observation, and I couldn't stop wondering. How many of us had been replaced? How many people I spoke to every day might not be people at all? The further we hiked, the more wrong the landscape became, trees bent into arcs like doorways, patches of bare dirt covered in spirals, and strange claw marks etched into bark like symbols written by something trying to learn a language it didn't speak, and we followed a set of footprints, fresh, human, Cole's boots, until they abruptly ended at a vertical wall of trees, and I felt panic rise because the tracks didn't turn, didn't double back, didn't split, they just stopped, like he walked into the trees and never came out, and that's when we smelled something metallic, not blood exactly, but something older, like wet rust, and Donna grabbed my arm and whispered, "We need to go now." But before we could turn, a sound echoed from the darkness, not footsteps, not branches snapping, but breathing, slow, strained, wet, like something was learning how lungs worked. We backed away, flashlights trembling, watching the black space between trees in case something stepped forward, and suddenly a voice came from behind us, weak, trembling, familiar. "Donna? Help!" And we whipped around expecting Cole, but no one was there, just bushes moving slightly, and I remember thinking that the voice sounded right, perfectly right, except there was no human emotion behind it, just a hollow recitation, like someone saying the correct words without understanding meaning. We retreated to base, and Briggs locked the doors, turned off the lights, and made us sit silently while he loaded a shotgun and leaned it against the wall, staring at the window like something might press its face against it at any moment, and after a long silence he said, "If anything knocks tonight, nobody answers, no matter how familiar the voice is," and I don't know which part terrified me more, that he said it casually, like a routine, or that the rest of the Rangers nodded because they'd done this before. Somewhere around 3 a.m. the radio crackled and a voice said, hiccuping breaths, "It's me, Cole, I'm cold, I'm bleeding, please open the door," and my heart nearly broke, because it sounded exactly like him, desperate and terrified, but Briggs didn't move, didn't blink, just stared ahead and said, "It's not him," and after a moment the voice changed tone, calmer, more analytical, and said, "Why didn't you come for me? Why didn't you answer?" Before the radio cut with a sharp, wet exhale. By dawn, none of us had slept, and as we went outside, we found footprints circling the building. Not human footprints, but elongated impressions, toes too long, stride too wide, and what made my skin crawl was that they weren't random. They formed patterns, loops, grids, arrangements, like someone had paced all night mapping us, studying us, memorizing our movements. The woods weren't just dangerous, they were hungry, and all of us pretended to ignore the truth. This wasn't nature, it was predation from something that didn't come from this world, something that learned, adapted, copied, experimented, and when I saw a figure at the tree lean at sunrise, tall, pale, motionless, wearing a uniform that looked like mine, I realized the most terrifying rule of Black Hollow wasn't the whistling or the tower or the false rangers, it was this: the longer you remain in the park, the more the park becomes you, and the more you become it, until eventually nobody can tell the difference. The next morning, when the park was still soaked in fog and the cold breath of dawn crawled through the trees like fingers searching for something to drag back underground, I woke to the sound of someone knocking on the ranger station door, and when I stumbled out of my bunk I assumed it was one of the volunteers or hikers who had gotten lost, but the way the knocking came, slow, methodical, as if whoever stood outside wasn't impatient or afraid but simply expecting me, sent a shiver through me. Because I hadn't told anyone I was awake yet, and the hour was too early for visitors, so I grabbed my jacket, brushed the cold from my shoulders, and opened the door just enough to see who waited outside. But there was nobody, only deep mist funneling between trees and the faintest trace of footprints in the dirt leading away from the building. Footprints too large to belong to any average man, wide and unnatural, with long impressions near the toes as if the foot had claws or talons, and I didn't want to admit it, but I recognized the shape because I'd seen something similar once when I was new to the job, back when the previous ranger, old Pete, was still breathing and still had enough sanity left not to wander the forest muttering about roots that hunt. And I remembered the night he'd shown me the footprint pressed into the mud by the creek, swearing it belonged to something that wasn't human. And he'd said never follow prints like those because you didn't track them, they tracked you. And that memory burned in my mind as I stepped back into the cabin and locked the door again, telling myself it was probably a bear or elk, anything easier to accept than the reality of what lurked in North Hollow Woods. But the radio crackled before I could sit down, and dispatch called from Central Station, asking if I could respond to a report of a missing camper, a man in his mid-40s named Paul, who had signed in 2 days ago and not signed out, and his car was still at the trailhead, meaning he never left, and I recited the usual protocol, wrote his name in the log, but something in my stomach tightened because missing hikers weren't unusual here, but missing hikers after hearing things at night. Screaming, chanting, bone snaps, soft moans echoing across valleys. Those cases had become more frequent these past few months, and nobody on the staff admitted it because paperwork and budgets didn't account for supernatural predators, so they just shrugged and called it animal activity, a phrase that meant nothing and explained nothing. So I packed a kit with flares, a thermal camera, water, and my old revolver because I didn't trust standard ranger's rifles when facing something that didn't blink or bleed right, and I hiked toward High Lantern Trail, the stretch of woods where Paul had last been seen, and as soon as I stepped beneath the tunnel of pines, I felt the air change, heavier, charged with that same static I'd felt the previous night in the watchtower when I thought shadows were moving beneath the trees, and every step turned the forest darker, quieter, as if birds didn't want to sing here anymore, and the silence clung to me until even my breath felt loud. So I kept walking, scanning the ground for prints or signs, and I found shredded fabric caught on a branch, bright red nylon with streaks of blood staining it, blood still wet enough to smear on my glove. And that meant whatever happened to this man hadn't happened days ago. It was fresh, maybe even within the last 12 hours, and my heartbeat staggered because if it was fresh, then the thing that did it wasn't far. And I lifted the thermal camera, sweeping the forest, looking for heat signatures, but everything came back cold except one flicker in the distance, like something large was hunched near a fallen tree, and I steadied my breathing, telling myself it could be a deer or bear feeding. But when the shape lifted its head, the outline was wrong, too tall, too narrow, with elongated limbs, and I froze, lowering the camera slowly. Because I'd learned that if they saw you move, they rushed you, and those things didn't run like animals. They sprinted like something starving, desperate, ancient, and I slowly backed behind a trunk, waiting long enough for my heartbeat to calm before checking again. But the signature was gone, vanished, and that was somehow worse because if it disappeared it meant it either fled or now knew I was here. So I kept moving, faster now, calling out Paul's name at intervals because sometimes humans respond when predators don't, but the forest swallowed my voice, sending nothing back, not even echoes, and after an hour of hiking, I heard something. A faint, repetitive tapping like someone knocking on wood, and I followed the sound, realizing it was coming from deeper in the ravine. And when I climbed down I found a backpack, torn open, contents scattered, and next to it, a small hunting knife, blade bent backward, handle cracked, as if someone had stabbed something too hard, and heard the weapon break, and I crouched to examine the tracks. Deep, erratic footsteps leading away from the scene, some with drag marks, meaning someone was pulled or dragged while fighting back, and I followed the trail even though every instinct told me to turn around. Because rangers don't abandon missing people, even when the people have already been eaten, and I walked for another mile until the trail ended at the riverbank, and there, hanging from a tree branch like a grotesque ornament, was what remained of Paul's torso, stripped clean of skin but arranged with precise intent, ribs spread like petals, organs absent, and the head missing, and I gagged, stepping back, because whatever did this didn't kill for hunger. It killed for ritual, and carved symbols into the exposed bone, symbols I recognized from Pete's journal, old marks said to belong to forest priests who worshipped something buried under these woods, something that demanded offerings, and before I could take a photo or radio. I heard movement behind me, slow footsteps, deliberate, crunching pine needles, and I turned, gun raised, expecting some monstrous shape, but instead, someone stepped into view wearing a park staff coat, though it wasn't someone I recognized, his hair matted, skin grayish, eyes sunken, and he smiled without warmth, saying, "You shouldn't be here, Ranger," and when he stepped closer, his coat split at the chest, revealing a mass of twisted roots fused into flesh, pulsing beneath the skin. And that's when I knew old Pete wasn't crazy, and that whatever haunted this forest didn't just hunt animals or hikers. It infected people, turned them into walking extensions of its hunger, guardians of its ritual. And the man reached out with a hand that wasn't entirely human anymore, fingers long and black at the tips, and he said, "This place doesn't belong to you." And the forest behind him seemed to breathe, branches bending inward, leaves quivering, as if responding to his voice, and for the first time in my life I didn't try to reason, I didn't try to warn him, I just fired, and the shot hit him in the chest, sending him stumbling back, but he didn't fall, he just laughed, coughing black fluid, and said, "The woods will take you too," and he vanished into the trees faster than anything human could move, and I stood there, shaking, trying to calm my breath, because I realized the forest wasn't just alive, it was watching, judging, deciding who belonged here and who was prey. I didn't chase the thing that wore a ranger coat and human skin like a costume, because deep in my bones I understood that it hadn't approached me to attack or kill, not yet, but to warn me, to tell me that I had crossed invisible boundaries, that the forest had already marked me, claimed me as part of a ritual I didn't understand. So I backed away from the mutilated remains hanging like trophies and forced myself back up the ravine, constantly listening for footsteps, breathing, rustling, anything that suggested the creature was stalking me, but the woods were silent again, completely dead, and that terrified me more because even predators make noise, even hungry beasts break branches, but whatever lived here was silent because it didn't have to hunt. It simply waited for you to walk into its grasp, waited for night to settle so it could drag you into roots and soil, and as I climbed I felt the urge to turn around, to look over my shoulder, because my mind kept whispering that I wasn't alone, that something tall and patient was shadowing me just out of sight, and every time I ignored the instinct my back prickled with the certainty that eyes were fixed on me, studying me like a specimen, like prey, and as soon as I reached higher ground, I radioed Central, calling in a code red, but static swallowed every word, the frequency mutilated by interference that wasn't random, because I'd heard storms, mountains, distance ruin signals before, but this wasn't that. This was a deliberate frequency, a hum beneath the static, like chanting or whispering, and I cut the radio off before the sound could crawl deeper into my head, because there was something about it that felt dangerous, hypnotic, like a voice disguised as noise, designed to lure you closer. So I kept walking until I reached a fork in the trail, and there I found fresh footprints, human this time, small, probably belonging to a woman or teenager. And what terrified me was that the footprints overlapped. Older ones, meaning someone alive had been through here recently, unaware, unprotected, and probably heading straight toward the damn ravine. So I followed, calling out in a low voice, "Hello? Park Ranger, if you're out here, respond." But no one answered, and 20 minutes later I found a woman sitting on a rock, clutching her jacket tight around her body, shaking violently, face streaked with tears, eyes wide with that hollow, shell-shocked look I'd seen on survivors of avalanches and fires, people who saw death coming and lived only by accident, and I approached carefully, not wanting to startle her, but before I could speak she whispered, "Don't come closer, it follows sound, it hears through the roots," and I froze, staring at her mud-covered boots, scratched arms, bloody knuckles, obvious signs of panic and escape, and I asked her if she was injured, if someone else was with her, but she shook her head, clenching her teeth against a sob, and said, "It took him, he tried to carry me, but it took him," and she pointed to the trees behind me, the way someone points toward a burning building still filled with people, and I turned slowly, scanning the woods, seeing nothing but endless pines and fog, but my stomach twisted because I knew she wasn't hallucinating. I knew something was out there, hiding, waiting, and I told her we needed to move, to get to the station before dark, and she nodded with the numb obedience of someone beyond fear, someone whose body moved only because instinct demanded survival. So we began walking the trail back, staying quiet, stepping carefully, and I kept looking at the roots that coiled across the ground, thin at first, but gradually thicker, until they resembled veins pulsing through soil, and I noticed how they connected tree to tree like a nervous system, and suddenly her words made sense. It hears through the roots, and that meant every vibration, every step, every shout traveled through this living lattice, alerting whatever it was, and I realized the forest wasn't just haunted. It was sentient, conscious, and the creatures weren't random predators. They were limbs, extensions, servants of something larger, something buried, and as we walked, she whispered, "It wants to grow," and I didn't ask what she meant because I was afraid of the answer, and just as we reached the clearing near the old watchtower, a distant scream echoed through the trees, high-pitched, human, rupturing the stillness, followed by a second sound, wet, heavy, like a body being dragged, and the woman collapsed to her knees, hands over her ears, whispering, "That's him, that's him," and I grabbed her, dragging her forward, telling her not to look, not to listen, because whatever was screaming might not be him anymore, might be the forest wearing his voice to lure her back, and as we reached the tower, I saw movement in the corner of my eye, shapes darting between trees, too fast, too thin, limbs bending like broken sticks, heads jerking with unnatural rhythm, and I aimed my revolver, firing 2 shots into the dark, but the bullets thudded into bark, useless, and the woman screamed as roots burst from the ground. Around her feet, writhing, reaching, like fingers desperate to anchor into flesh, and I grabbed her, ripping her free, hauling her up the tower steps 2 at a time while the wood shook beneath us, and something slammed into the base of the structure, making the whole tower lurch, as though a creature the size of a bear, but shaped wrong, was battering it from below, and she sobbed, curling against the far wall, mumbling words I didn't understand, words that sounded like prayer or plea, and I peered out into the forest, flashlight sweeping, and I saw them. Dozens of pale faces staring up at us from between trees, eyes black, mouths open as if mid-scream, and when one stepped into the beam of light, I realized its teeth weren't teeth but sharpened bone, protruding outward like fangs carved by hand, and every instinct in me screamed run. But there was nowhere to run because the woods weren't a place anymore. They were a trap, and the things that lived here weren't hunting. They were gathering. I didn't sleep that night inside the tower, not because I didn't try, but because every time I closed my eyes I heard the forest breathing, not wind, not branches scraping, but a slow, wet inhalation, as though the trees were sucking air through unseen lungs, and the woman, whose name I still didn't know because she only spoke in broken, fragmented sentences, lay curled on the floor, staring at her own trembling hands, whispering that she could feel things under her skin, crawling, planting themselves, and I told her she was in shock, that nothing was inside her, but I didn't believe my own words, not after what I had seen at the ravine, not after I watched the roots move like they were searching for bodies to latch onto, and at some point, after hours of silence, she said, "They weren't always here, they came when the forest got sick," and when I asked what she meant she didn't answer. She just pressed her palms against her eyes and cried silently, and I sat by the window, rifle in my lap, scanning the dark tree line illuminated only by moonlight and the dying glow of the tower's lantern, seeing nothing but shadows but feeling watched the entire time, feeling as though every tree had eyes, every trunk was a spine, and every branch a skeletal arm reaching toward me, and I thought about the mutilated rangers, the footprints, the scream. Something intelligent and predatory was orchestrating these horror shows, arranging bodies like warnings, ripping them open with surgical precision, and the idea hit me so suddenly that I almost said it aloud. Something in this forest is learning, evolving, adapting, and the creatures weren't just killers, they were soldiers, scouts, or vessels, and when morning finally bled over the horizon, thin and gray and suffocating, I took the woman outside because I didn't want to stay boxed in like bait, but the moment we stepped onto the trail I knew something had changed. Because the forest was different in daylight, not safer, just more honest, as if it wanted me to see what it had become. And as we walked, I noticed birds nailed to trees with their beaks, hundreds of them, wings spread, bodies dried and hollowed, strung up in a pattern that wasn't random, almost like runes or symbols carved from death, and the woman whispered, "It marks territory with feeders," and I asked what that meant, but she just walked faster, like she needed to get away before something saw us, and I realized how wrong I'd been the night before. Those faces hadn't been watching us because they wanted to kill. They were watching because they were waiting for orders, waiting for daylight to end, waiting for the signal of something older than them, something buried below our feet. And as we reached the old ranger compound, a burned-out collection of cabins and shattered windows, I saw claw marks in the ash, deep gashes in the wood that didn't look like rage but writing, symbols, spirals, teeth-like curves, as though a creature with too many fingers had tried to communicate, and I stepped inside the main cabin where a dozen ranger uniforms were laid out on the floor, neatly arranged, empty, but stained with dried blood around the necks and sleeves, and the woman stared at them and said, "They take the clothes so they look human," and my blood froze because suddenly it all clicked. The creature wearing the ranger coat wasn't mocking us, it was mimicking us, learning how to walk upright, how to lure, how to speak, and as if summoned by the thought, a voice echoed through the forest, not a scream, not an animal cry, but a single word, stretched and broken, like a vocal cord learning to function. "Help," and the woman clamped her hands over her mouth and shook her head violently, whispering, "Don't answer, it doesn't ask because it needs, it asks because you will respond." But I stepped outside anyway because the training drilled into me was stronger than instinct, and I scanned the tree line until I saw something. Standing 20 yards away, wearing torn ranger pants and no shirt, its skin blistered and pale, eyes swollen shut, and its jaw hung crooked, as though someone had stretched it too far while pulling it on, and the creature lifted its arm in a stiff, mechanical wave and said again, "Help!" But this time its voice cracked and another voice spoke through it, layered beneath, deeper, older, rumbling like a throat filled with soil, and I raised my weapon, telling it to stop, but it kept walking with broken marionette steps, and the woman screamed, "Don't shoot! They don't die right! They don't die right!" But my hand squeezed the trigger anyway, reflex overriding reason, and the bullet tore through its skull, knocking it backward. But there was no blood, no collapse, because the creature didn't fall, it simply paused, head cocked sideways, as if analyzing the damage, and then its face split open from chin to ear, revealing a nest of roots writhing beneath, and before I could fire again, the creature turned and ran, not away but toward the deeper forest, toward something that waited, and the woman whispered, "You told it we're here," and she ran to the cabin and barricaded the door, leaving me outside, and as I pounded on the wood begging her to let me in, I heard the ground beneath us begin to tremble, slow at first, then rhythmic, pulsing, and the trees bent, not from wind, but from something moving underground, something massive, and suddenly the woman yanked me inside and screamed, "There is no rescue, there is only harvest," and then the window exploded. Inward as the faces from the night before swarmed the compound, dozens of them, running like insects, screaming with stolen voices, and through the shattered doorway I saw the forest open, literally open, as black soil split like flesh, and something enormous began to rise, something with antlers made of bone, a skull too big to belong to any animal, and a body made of tangled roots braided into limbs, and its eyes were hollow pits filled with moving shapes, and I realized this wasn't a monster. It was a god of its own ecosystem, a king of decay, and we were nothing more than fertilizer for its evolution. I didn't sleep that night inside the tower, not because I didn't try, but because every time I closed my eyes I heard the forest breathing, not wind, not branches scraping, but a slow, wet inhalation, as though the trees were sucking air through unseen lungs, and the woman, whose name I still didn't know because she only spoke in broken, fragmented sentences, lay curled on the floor, staring at her own trembling hands, whispering that she could feel things under her skin, crawling, planting themselves, and I told her she was in shock, that nothing was inside her, but I didn't believe my own words, not after what I had seen at the ravine, not after I watched the roots move like they were searching for bodies to latch onto, and at some point, after hours of silence, she said, "They weren't always here, they came when the forest got sick," and when I asked what she meant she didn't answer. She just pressed her palms against her eyes and cried silently, and I sat by the window, rifle in my lap, scanning the dark tree line illuminated only by moonlight and the dying glow of the tower's lantern, seeing nothing but shadows but feeling watched the entire time, feeling as though every tree had eyes, every trunk was a spine, and every branch a skeletal arm reaching toward me, and I thought about the mutilated rangers, the footprints, the scream. Something intelligent and predatory was orchestrating these horror shows, arranging bodies like warnings, ripping them open with surgical precision, and the idea hit me so suddenly that I almost said it aloud. Something in this forest is learning, evolving, adapting, and the creatures weren't just killers, they were soldiers, scouts, or vessels, and when morning finally bled over the horizon, thin and gray and suffocating, I took the woman outside because I didn't want to stay boxed in like bait, but the moment we stepped onto the trail I knew something had changed, because the forest was different in daylight, not safer, just more honest, as if it wanted me to see what it had become, and as we walked, I noticed birds nailed to trees with their beaks, hundreds of them, wings spread, bodies dried and hollowed, strung up in a pattern that wasn't random, almost like runes or symbols carved from death, and the woman whispered, "It marks territory with feeders," and I asked what that meant, but she just walked faster, like she needed to get away before something saw us, and I realized how wrong I'd been the night before. Those faces hadn't been watching us because they wanted to kill, they were watching because they were waiting for orders, waiting for daylight to end, waiting for the signal of something older than them, something buried below our feet, and as we reached the old ranger compound, a burned-out collection of cabins and shattered windows, I saw claw marks in the ash, deep gashes in the wood that didn't look like rage but writing, symbols, spirals, teeth-like curves, as though a creature with many fingers had tried to communicate, and I stepped inside the main cabin where a dozen ranger uniforms were laid out on the floor, neatly arranged, empty, but stained with dried blood around the necks and sleeves, and the woman stared at them and said, "They take the clothes so they look human," and my blood froze because suddenly it all clicked. The creature wearing the ranger coat wasn't mocking us, it was mimicking us, learning how to walk upright, how to lure, how to speak, and as if summoned by the thought, a voice echoed through the forest, not a scream, not an animal cry, but a single word, stretched and broken, like a vocal cord learning to function. "Help!" And the woman clamped her hands over her mouth and shook her head violently, whispering, "Don't answer, it doesn't ask because it needs, it asks because you will respond." But I stepped outside anyway because the training drilled into me was stronger than instinct, and I scanned the tree-line until I saw something. Standing 20 yards away, wearing torn ranger pants and no shirt, its skin blistered and pale, eyes swollen shut, and its jaw hung crooked, as though someone had stretched it too far while pulling it on, and the creature lifted its arm in a stiff mechanical wave and said again, "Help!" But this time its voice cracked and another voice spoke through it, layered beneath, deeper, older, rumbling like a throat filled with soil, and I raised my weapon, telling it to stop, but it kept walking with broken marionette steps, and the woman screamed, "Don't shoot! They don't die right! They don't die right!" But my hand squeezed the trigger anyway, reflex overriding reason, and the bullet tore through its skull, knocking it backward. But there was no blood, no collapse, because the creature didn't fall, it simply paused, head cocked sideways, as if analyzing the damage, and then its face split open from chin to ear, revealing a nest of roots writhing beneath, and before I could fire again, the creature turned and ran, not away but toward the deeper forest, toward something that waited, and the woman whispered, "You told it we're here," and she ran to the cabin and barricaded the door, leaving me outside, and as I pounded on the wood begging her to let me in, I heard the ground beneath us begin to tremble, slow at first, then rhythmic, pulsing, and the trees bent, not from wind, but from something moving underground, something massive, and suddenly the woman yanked me inside and screamed, "There is no rescue, there is only harvest." And then the window exploded. Inward as the faces from the night before swarmed the compound, dozens of them, running like insects, screaming with stolen voices, and through the shattered doorway I saw the forest open, literally open, as black soil split like flesh, and something enormous began to rise, something with antlers made of bone, a skull too big to belong to any animal, and a body made of tangled roots braided into limbs, and its eyes were hollow pits filled with moving shapes, and I realized this wasn't a monster. It was a god of its own ecosystem, a king of decay, and we were nothing more than fertilizer for its evolution. I didn't sleep for even a second in that crawlspace, because the forest didn't sleep. The forest pulsed like a living machine, beating and breathing in slow rhythmic waves above us, and every pulse carried with it the sound of bones grinding, roots stretching, voices screaming, and the woman beside me, who had been brave, defiant, almost unbreakable, was now silent, her face drained of color, her eyes staring up at the boards above us as though she could see through them, watching the bone god grow taller, stronger, hungrier, and what terrified me most wasn't the footsteps or the scraping claws, but the whispers that seeped through the wood, not in English, not in human language, but in some broken imitation of humanity, fragments of speech stolen from the throats of the damned, echoing into the darkness like a broadcast of suffering, and the whispers formed questions. "Why did you leave us? Where did you go? Why didn't you answer?" And it hit me that the voices I heard weren't random. They were the voices of the rangers, the hikers, the missing, each of them preserved, repurposed, their fear encoded into the consciousness of the organism like data in a hard drive, and the woman finally spoke, barely able to breathe. "It wants you, it chose you when you entered the woods," and I wanted to tell her she was wrong, that this creature didn't choose, it consumed at random, but deep down I knew she was right, because I had heard my name whispered in the wind since the first night, a soft, patient calling, as though something beneath the soil had already acknowledged me as its next vessel, and I realized the worst truth of all. This wasn't a survival story, this wasn't a hunt. It was a recruitment, a collection, a harvest, and I was simply late to the ceremony. So when the boards above us began to crack and splinter, raining dirt and wood and webbed roots onto our heads, the woman didn't scream. She didn't run, she simply bowed her head and whispered, "Don't answer." But I didn't understand until I heard the voice, not from outside, but from directly inside my skull, a voice so familiar that I almost cried, because it was my father's voice, perfectly replicated, calling my name the way he had when I was a child lost in a crowd. "Come here, it's safe," and the sound of it cracked me open, pulling on every memory, every moment of trust, every instance of unconditional love, and I felt myself reaching toward the trapdoor without even knowing my hand was moving, and the woman grabbed my wrist, nails digging into my skin so deeply blood ran down my arm, whispering with shaking breath, "It knows your mind, don't listen, don't follow," and her voice was almost drowned out by the new chorus rising above us, hundreds of voices speaking in unison, all wearing familiar tones, speaking the names of every lost loved one in history. A symphony of dead voices performing the most powerful seduction there is, the promise of reunion, and a massive bone plated hand forced its way through the ceiling, fingers stretching like sharpened branches, roots dragging behind them like veins, searching, probing, feeling, and the moment it touched my shoulder, the world around me disappeared, and I stood in a memory that wasn't mine anymore, a perfect reconstruction of my childhood home, my father alive, smiling, sitting at the kitchen table with breakfast waiting, but the air smelled like dirt, like rot, and when I looked at him, his face flickered like a faulty screen, and his eyes were too wide, too hollow, a dark root twisting in and out of the pupil like a parasite, and he said, "Stay here with me forever," and I realized with horror that the organism didn't just consume physical bodies. It hijacked memories, bent nostalgia into a weapon, weaponized grief, and I screamed myself back into reality, collapsing on dirt as the bone hand dragged me upward, lifting me like a toy, even a second and outside space. The world had transformed into a cathedral of living death. Pulsed like a massive root creature now towering above treetops. Slow rhythmic waves above us, cracked wide open, every pulse carrying hundreds of bodies fused inside it like stained glass windows. Voices screaming, human bodies contorted into arcs of muscle, who had been brave and defiant, all glowing faintly with bioluminescent veins, her face drained of writhing, moaning, and every mouth open simultaneously, as though she projecting a howl that shattered windows for miles. A sound taller, stronger, powerful that didn't exist. And what terrified me most wasn't the footsteps or the scraping claws, distant whispers that seeped through the wood. Not from this forest, not in English, not from this region, human language, but from far beyond, broken imitation miles away. Hundreds of organisms stolen from the throats of the damned, awakening into the darkness, as if the planet itself had just received a signal. And the whispers, and the woman climbed up through the shattered cabin. Why did you leave us? Where did you go? Holding a flare gun. Why didn't and a glass bottle filled with something and it hit thick me that the voices and she screamed at me. Random. This is the They were the voices of the rangers, it's how it the hikers, the missing, and she raised the bottle of them preserved, repurposed, threatening to destroy their fear encoded into the consciousness of the organism I didn't like think nature could achieve, moving its massive head down, barely able to scraping through trees like scythes. It chose you when you entered the woods, ripping branches and I wanted to tell her she was wrong, that this creature didn't choose, revealing a vortex of vines reaching down. I knew she was right, grabbing her legs, I had heard my name whispered in the dragging her up the first, pulling her inside, soft, patient calling. As though something beneath the soil had already acknowledged me, and I watched in pure horror, and I realized the worst truth of all. This wasn't a survival story. Snapping. This wasn't organs rearranging. It was a recruitment until she was nothing more than another fleshy patch, and I was simply late to the ceremony. But so when the boards above us began to crack and splinter, still conscious and wood still and webbed roots onto our heads, the word "run." The woman didn't scream, even though the organism was already dragging me into the massive body, and whispered, and I felt my legs compress, bones bending, I didn't understand joints until twisting. I heard the voice, and the only reason I didn't become part of it was because the flare gun she had dropped fired on so familiar that I almost igniting cried, a massive fireball because it was my father's voice, the creature's perfectly replicated, setting calling my name the way he had when I was a child lost in a crowd. Not
Come
in pain,
here, it's safe.
but in rage,
And the sound
a
of it
howl
cracked
so
me
powerful
open,
the trees
pulling
around
on
us
every
bowed,
memory,
uprooted,
every moment
and
of trust,
collapsed, every
and I
instance
felt from
of
its grasp,
unconditional love,
crawling across
and I
burning
felt
soil,
myself reaching
lungs
toward
filling
the
with smoke,
trapdoor
eyes
without even
blinded
knowing
by
my
ash,
hand was.
and I stumbled
moving,
through the forest
and a woman
as the
grabbed my
ground
wrist,
buckled and
nails digging into my
split,
skin so
roots
deeply
bursting
blood
from
ran
earth
down
like
my
spears,
arms,
whispering
whispering with
trees,
shaking breath,
animals,
it
everything.
knows your mind,
And behind
don't
me,
listen, don't
I could
follow.
hear the creature
And her voice
rebuilding,
was almost
absorbing
drowned out by
fire,
the new chorus
consuming
rising
it,
above us,
evolving from it,
hundreds of
because
voices
death
speaking
wasn't
in
a threat.
unison.
It
All
was
wearing
fuel,
familiar
and
tones,
by the time I reached
speaking
the
the
tree
names
ring,
of every
the
lost
horizon
loved
was
one in
alive.
history.
For
A
as far
symphony of
beyond
dead
this one
voices
glowing with
performing the
movement,
most
as if
powerful
every dark
seduction
corner
there
of the
is.
world was
The
awakening,
promise of reunion
synchronized
and a
pulsing,
massive
rising,
bone, and a single
plated
hand
catastrophic
forced its way
truth
through the
carved
ceiling,
itself
fingers
into my
stretching
mind.
like sharpened branches.
This was not
roots
an
dragging behind
event.
them like veins.
It was an extinction
searching,
cycle,
probing,
and
feelings
feeling.
weren't witnessing
And the moment it touched
we were
my
feeding
shoulder,
it.
the
And as I
world
ran
around me
toward the empty
disappeared,
highway,
and I stood
covered
in a
in
memory
dirt,
that wasn't
blood,
mine
and smoke.
anymore.
I felt
the perfect
earth tremble
reconstruction
beneath
of
my
my
feet.
childhood home,
The first sign
my
that the
father
roots
alive,
were expanding,
smiling,
tunneling,
sitting at the
reaching,
kitchen table with
preparing
breakfast
to emerge
waiting.
everywhere.
But the air
Asphalt had
smelled like
replaced
dirt,
soil,
like rock,
because the organism
and when I
wasn't
looked
just
at
a
him,
creature.
His
It
face
was a planet-sized
like
intelligence,
a faulty
reclaiming
screen,
its property,
and his eyes were
and
too
the last
wide,
sound
too hollow.
I heard before
A
the
dark
night
root
twisting
went
in and out of the
dark
pupil
was.
like a parasite.
A
And he
thousand
said,
voices
"Stay
speaking
here
through
with
a
me
single
forever."
throat.
And I realized
We
with
are
horror
awake.
that the organism didn't just consume physical bodies. It hijacked memories, bent nostalgia into a weapon, weaponized grief, and I screamed myself back into reality, collapsing on dirt as the bone hand dragged me upward.